Now, I've never really understood why this is such a prevalent issue and not taken more seriously, but so often applications lack any brute force protection, and this allows us to do things like enumerate valid usernames and attack accounts by guessing their password or MFA code, etc., etc. The way we brute force is quite context dependent. If we're on a pen test and inside a network, we might be targeting a system using accounts that we've already enumerated. If we're doing bug bounty, we're likely restricted to accounts that we've created, but actually, quite often, we're not allowed to do brute force at all. And if we're doing pre-release testing, then likely we'll want to create a number of different accounts and uncover how we might attack them using this technique and use that as a demonstration for the engineers so that this can be remediated before the application goes live. When we do come to carrying out a brute force attack, these are the things we want to keep an eye out for. In particular, when testing web apps, and not just when we're testing for brute force, content length is a really important header, and I recommend you get into the habit of keeping an eye on this during your testing, checking it before, and every time you send a request, glance over and take a mental note of what the value is. It'll often flag changes in the application behavior that you might overlook while testing for vulnerabilities if you're just looking at the results or the status code. And finally, we'll often need word lists for our attacks. And these are the ones I recommend you start out with. Over time, you might want to merge some of these together or curate your own, but for our purposes, they are ideal. Let's take a quick look at how you can install and get hold of these word lists. So let me show you quickly where we can find these word lists we were just talking about. So first up, if we come to Firefox and Google, and we just want to search for asset note word lists, you can see we have wordlists.assetnotes.io, and we can click on this. They're also available on GitHub, and you can come in and download the ones that you want. If you're interested in fuzzing APIs with Kite Runner, which is covered in the API hacking course, then these routes are here. But here we have directories, parameters, different technologies, and subdomains, and all sorts of other useful lists. Now, once we've got those, we can also install sacklists. So we can just sudo apt install sacklists, and this will go ahead and install sacklists for us, and I'll quickly show you where the default installation path is once it's done. Alright, so now this is finished, we can ls user share sacklists, and you can see that all of the word lists are in here, so we can come into something like discovery, and then we can come into web content, and then here you have things like, here you have things like Cold Fusion lists or Apache, APIs, big.txt, which is like directories, and things like this. And if you want to be able to find a list and you're not sure exactly where it is or what subfolder it's in, we can find /user share sacklists. And what I recommend you do is use -i names. So this is case insensitive, and then 2 asterisks, and then let's search for subdomain, for example. And when we hit enter, we can see that, yeah, the subdomains top 1 million, so the 5,000 of this top 1 million is here, and then there's the Bitquark subdomains, etc., etc. So you can easily find lists that you're looking for. And let's say we want usernames. We can see we have SAP default usernames, the ZatoNet 10 million top usernames, MS SQL top username shortlist, etc., etc. So this is a command that's super helpful. Of course, you can just go into the file system and look through at user share sacklists, but this is a little bit quicker in my opinion. So now let's walk through the process of setting up a brute force attack and understanding what we need to be on the lookout for before we take on a challenge. We'll step through it first with Burp Suite Pro, and then I realize not everybody is using the professional edition of Burp Suite, so we'll demo the same attack using an open source alternative as well. If you are on the Community Edition, then I still recommend you give it a try, as it's likely that at some point in the future you'll be working with Burp Suite Pro, so even if it's throttled, go through the process so that you understand how to use the tool and carry out this attack. So a couple of things to set up this lab. We do get some candidate usernames and candidate passwords, and these are quite useful to cut down the time on the attack so that we can continue learning and we're not just sat around waiting for our brute force attack to finish. So let's just click on this, and looks like it gives us some text rather than a download. So I'm just going to select all of these, copy this to my clipboard, come to the terminal, and I'm just going to vim, you can use nano or whatever you want, usernames.txt, paste those in here, and then do the same for the passwords. So just come back, candidate passwords, copy these. If my mouse wheel will actually work. Whoa, that's a bit annoying. Maybe if I just select the first one, scroll down, hold shift, grab the last one, that's a bit easier. Vim, passwords.txt, and paste this in here. Alright, so let's come over to the lab, and we know that we're looking for username enumeration via different responses, and this is something that we should always be on the lookout for. And so we come to here, and if I type in test, for example, and the password test, we get invalid username. So whenever I see this, I think, hey, okay, so if I have a valid username and an invalid password, this will probably change to invalid password. Notice that, interestingly, the number of characters for username and password is the same, so this is obviously a 8-character string, and password is also an 8-character string. So if you're just looking at the content length in Intruder, you might not see any difference, but we can use the filters or search or other things to try and find the difference between the requests. And as you'll see later on as well, we can also look at timing differences and other things as well when the error message isn't quite so verbose or precise. So let's come to Burp Suite, HTTP history, and looks like this is the request that we want. So post to /login and the username test, password test. So let's send this to intruder, Control I, or you can right click and send to intruder. And here what we want to do is, we don't care about the password so much, we want to first find a valid username. So hopefully we'll be able to find a valid username, and once we've done that, we'll then be able to find a valid password. So we'll come to payloads, and I'm just going to click load, and then we're going to come to /home and Kali, and we're going to use the usernames list that we saved. And let's just go ahead and do this. Of course, we get the warning about the application being throttled, and this is okay for the time being. Alright, so now this is almost done. I'm just going to come over to here, and I'm going to check the length first as the first thing that we see, and you can see there is actually one result that is slightly different. So I'm a little bit surprised at this, considering what we said about the length of the string username and passwords. But let's go ahead and look at what happens. So we come in here, we see the response, and we can either look through the code here, or we can just quickly hit render, and it says incorrect password. I wonder if this is different to... Yeah, so before we had invalid, so it's actually using a different string here, which I suppose is probably just so that we can easily find this on the lab. Now, if we didn't have this and the length was still 3248, but we weren't sure, we could filter, and unfortunately it's restricted by Pro only, but what I would do is I would put a keyword in here like invalid username, and then I would do the negative search, so any response that doesn't have invalid username would then show up. Apologies, I forgot this was a pro feature, and we'll see this later on probably as we look more into Burp Suite Pro. So now we have the right username, we can actually just take this request and once again press Ctrl-I, and we can go ahead and close this. And you can see that it's created a new request for us and it's filled in the username. So we've got the exact same request as before, which is quite nice because sometimes when we're working between requests and things like that, some things we might change the headers or something else might be a little bit different. So keeping it nice and clean like this is always a good way to go. And then all we're going to do now is highlight the password, come to payloads and load in our passwords.txt, and once again click Start Attack. And I think this time probably what will happen is we will get forwarded on a successful login, knowing that that's quite common in the Portswigger labs, so we'll look for 302. This is also quite common across a lot of applications. When you get a successful login, you'll get a status code 302 because you'll be forwarded to like a dashboard or an account page, rather than it just returning status code 200 and being like, hey, you had incorrect credentials. We can also once again look at the length, and we'll look at this a little bit later on, but we can see things like the timing of the responses, cookies, and some other columns too. I'll let this run and then I'll see you back here once it's finished. Alright, looks like this is still going, but while it's running we can come in and filter, and as predicted it looks like we got a 302 here with the payload Michelle, and of course the length is different as well, so we could have filtered on either of these, or sorted should I say, on either of these, and it looks like we would find the request. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to verify this, so I'm just going to take AdKit, come to here, and then Michelle, and come to here, and log in, and here we are. Congratulations, you solved the lab. Alright, so now that we've solved this lab, what we're actually going to do is solve it using FFUF. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this request and copy it. And obviously you could copy it from anywhere. So for example, proxy HTTP history, and we could grab the request from here. In fact, let's just go ahead and do that. And here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to vim request.txt and paste this in. And here what I want to do is I want to create two keywords, so fuzz user and fuzz password. And what we're going to do is use FFUF to try and fuzz this application for a correct username and password. And so when we do this, we do FFUF and then we do the request flag and we pass in request.txt so it knows what the request looks like and where it's going. We also need to pass in request proto like this and set it to HTTP. Now, because we're actually going to do the username and the password at the same time, I'm going to use the mode cluster bomb, and we haven't actually seen this on Burp Suite yet, but we'll see this later on. And this is basically where we come into the positions. We have a single attack here, which is the sniper mode, and the cluster bomb is going to mix the payloads. So if we have both of these as payloads, it's going to try every username with every password. So it's going to try Alex, password 1, password 2, password 3, Bob, password 1, password 2, password 3, etc., and go through all of the variations. So let's do our first word list, and we're just going to do user share. Actually, no, we're not. We're going to do home, Kali, usernames.txt, and we need to add the keyword fuzz user. And then we also need to add our password list, so /home/Kali, and then passwords.txt. And you'll notice that I'm auto completing using the tab key, by the way. So this just makes sure that I don't have a typo and makes life a little bit easier. And we'll call this fuzz pass. And now what I think we can do is, since we know that we're searching for a 302, which I suppose is cheating a little bit, but we could, of course, list out all the responses and then look for one that has a different content length or a different response code. But in this case, I'm just going to search for 302s and see how we get on. You can see in the cluster bomb mode, there's actually a lot of requests. So we have 10,000 requests going out, although of course we're not throttled, so this is going to go quite quickly. But this is going to be a lot more requests than going through and verifying the username first, and then verifying the password afterwards. And it looks like it didn't actually find anything, so obviously I made a mistake somewhere, and I suspect we need to change this to HTTPS. So let me rerun this and see whether we are successful. Aha. And here we are. We get the status 302 for Michelle and AdKit. Now, once again, we kind of knew that we were looking for a 302, and if we were approaching this as part of a pen test, then what would probably happen is I would actually create some users and then test against those users that I know exist, so that I can see what the valid login looks like, what an invalid login looks like, etc. So it's not a stretch to imagine that we would see this, but of course if we didn't use the MC-MC302, you can see that we have a lot of results that we would have to output to file, and then probably what I would do is just do like a reverse grep. So for example, search for all of the lines that didn't have words 2115 and 95 lines. So I would grab something like this, because as you can see, it's repeated every time. And then I would filter based on this. And it's a little bit more annoying than Burp Suite, where we can just click on the columns and do things. But once again, if you don't have access to Burp Suite Pro, then, you know, this takes a little bit longer, but is just as powerful, so it shouldn't hold you back. All right, next up, we have a challenge lab for you. So try and spend at least 30 minutes solving the lab. And of course, this has a similar type of attack. So the username enumeration is a little bit different. So you need to keep an eye out, understand the results, and find ways to filter out ones that might be subtly different from others. Don't forget to update your notes as you go, and I'll see you back here afterwards for the walkthrough. Good luck.